Welcome to Rethinking Economics, a Henry George School podcast series. Rethinking Economics is all about questioning the core foundations of economics. This series questions economic orthodoxy to better understand the forces and shifts shaping our society and the world. Together, we'll interrogate things like the efficacy of economic models, if mainstream assumptions are always correct, and why the ideas and concepts you learn about in textbooks may lead us astray. Today's episode will be part of a three-part series where I, your host, Nathan Greene, interview a group of current professors here at Clark University. I was first introduced to this concept of development in my Economic Growth and Development course at St. John's University. There, we explored how economic growth led to improvements in living standards that allowed people to achieve their full potential. This is what Nobel laureate Amartya Sen calls his capability approach, when societies are able to produce the conditions necessary for people to flourish. But since coming to Clark, my idea of development has changed. I began to separate economic development from development as a whole. Growth wasn't always desirable and could even lead to entrenched inequalities, environmental degradation, or accumulation by dispossession. So I want to ask you, what does development mean to you? Is it different from economic growth? Are the two mutually exclusive? And should we even strive for economic growth? To answer these questions, I've enlisted the help of three of my professors who have helped me shape my understanding of development. Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. Denise Bebbington to get a macro-level understanding of the impacts of economic growth. I hope you find these conversations stimulating and enjoy listening to them just as much as I did having them. Dr. Denise Bebbington is currently a research associate professor at Clark University, where she is the co-director of the Center for the Study of Natural Resources Extraction and Society, a research institute within Clark. Before she became a professor, Dr. Bebbington worked as a representative to Peru for the Inter-American Foundation, South American Regional Subdirector for Catholic Relief Services, and Latin American Program Coordinator for the Global Green Grants Fund. She has extensive on-the-ground experience working on development projects in South America, especially when it comes to democratization and strengthening institutions. Her research focuses on the political ecology of Latin America's extractives industries and how it impacts indigenous communities. Her writings explore the intersections of gender, the environment, and development. She has authored and co-authored numerous books and articles for publications such as Environmental Science and Policy, World Development, the European Review of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, as well as many others. She earned her bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley in history, her master's in development management from American University, and her Ph.D. in development policy and management from the University of Manchester. Together, we discussed why conventional economic indicators like GDP fail to capture the true development story of a country, Latin America's growth in the 21st century, and why large-scale infrastructure projects tend to be disruptive to people's way of living. We hope you enjoy this talk, and please make sure to check back on our page every week for a brand new episode. Dr. Denise Bebbington, thank you for coming on to the podcast today. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Nathan. It's great to be here.
So, my goal for today is to explore what economic growth is. The title of this series is Rethinking Economics, and I'm really hoping to place economic growth within the development context. So to do that, I just kind of wanted to give our listeners a little bit of context just to make sure they understand. So when we talk about economic growth, we have the Keynesian model, which is what dominates economic models today. And the way countries or societies grow is they grow their economy, which is measured through GDP. So, of course, we have C plus I plus G plus NX. That's how you determine GDP. And so just to break those down a little bit, we have consumption, investment, government spending, and exports. And so for many, many years, the goal of economic growth was to boost consumption, have people spend more, be able to afford their healthcare, housing, education, things like that. We have investment in government spending, which is building roads and bridges, infrastructure, things like that. And then, of course, we have trade, which is growing industries to be able to boost your exports and really grow through there. This has permeated development for a very long time. We can see this from thinkers like Rostow, Sachs, and even more contemporary thinkers like Stefan de Croo. And so, of course, the growth conversation has dominated development. I'm wondering, how do development practitioners see growth? Do they always see it as good? And why or why not?
Well, development practitioners is a big open field, right? A diverse group of folks. And so there'll be certainly a sector of development practitioners who see development and economic growth as closely linked. I think there's another group, and I'll put myself in this other group, that see economic growth as a part of the picture, but not necessarily the most important part of the picture. In other words, there may be constraints in society that are inhibiting people from being able to live lives, purposeful lives, lives with meaning, lives in which they can participate. And therefore, they can't participate in the economy, and they will not be able to take benefits from economic growth. So I'll talk about this a bit later, but I think there's many who see reasons why large segments of the population can't participate in the economy as the economy is structured, as society allows or not people to live their lives. So economic growth is part of the challenge, but certainly not all of the challenge if we think historically about the challenge of development.
And so, what are some examples, either theoretical or real world, where people are left out? I know you have a lot of experience in South America. Is there anything from your experience you could draw upon there?
Right. So part of this it directly comes from living in South America. And I have always been interested in discussions of equality and human rights. And this is linked to the time I spent in Chile, Honduras, Peru, and Guatemala in my 20s, right? This is the 1980s and a bit of the 1990s. And many of the governments were under authoritarian rule or just emerging. And so we're under a sort of fragile or precarious democratic rule. These are countries with large indigenous populations. Sometimes people were not recognized as indigenous because governments didn't want to do that. Governments tended to ignore or otherwise sort of reframe their social and cultural richness, right? And at times they had to acknowledge indigenous populations, but by and large, if they could avoid that, they would. And they would use other terms, promoting concepts of peasantry and mestizaje as sort of in a narrative around what it meant to be modern, what it meant to be moving forward for progress, right? So recognizing indigenous populations was tricky because that was seen as being backward, right? And if you think at the time, leftist political parties were largely, they were important social movements, but they were focused on class struggle, right? Struggles around land reform, wages, basic labor conditions, et cetera. And this is a time when there were lots of state-owned mines, state-owned oil companies, right? The state owned and directed, if you will, a lot of production. So we hit the 90s and we see the emergence of a lot of identity-based movements, right, who began to mobilize for the right to be recognized, the right to speak their own language, the right to be educated in their language, the right to ancestral lands and territory, the right to have the same opportunity as men, right, because a lot of the feminist movements start emerging. And at the same time, neoliberal policies are shrinking and reshaping states, including the public sector, leaving huge numbers of people without jobs. So this is all sort of, my experience and how it shapes how I understand the challenge of development. In South America, our the greatest challenge is really around addressing inequality. Okay, and inequality that is linked to discrimination and historical discrimination and marginalization. So, you go to a place like Northeast Brazil, where there are huge numbers of people who don't have access to land, access to resources, who live in extreme poverty. It's a big pocket of extreme poverty in South America, and have historically been discriminated against, and are still waiting for a government that can respond to their needs. And it's a serious challenge. I mean, for historical reasons, Northeast Brazil is sort of a special case. I also spent a lot of time in Peru and Bolivia with large indigenous populations, with histories for treating those indigenous populations very different. And, one of the things that formal thinking of economic growth doesn't fully capture all the economic activity of historically marginalized people. So it's a challenge. I would say we've applied sort of partial approaches, partial strategies, but we came with lots of ideas. And I think I look back at this with a lot of humility, that all of us should have been much more humble in terms of what we think might be accomplished.
If I may play devil's advocate for a little bit here, I think an economist might say, yes, those things do happen. There are some people who are still marginalized, but across the region and the world, living standards have improved quite drastically. I know in the 19th or 20th century, South America was much more unstable, both economic and politically. Of course, many nations had just newly become independent, and so they're still trying to establish their governments, their democratic systems, their economy. But as a whole, even if you take into consideration things like import substitution, industrialization, and structural reforms, things have improved quite drastically. In 1920, there was 1.8 billion people. In 2024, we have 8 billion people. The average life expectancy in 1920 was 31. Today it's 72, and so it's doubled. And so I think economists would say that we have made a lot of progress, but there is still much to do. Are they overlooking the people who are still marginalized, who are still in poverty, who are forced out of the labor market? Do they need to be looking at inequalities more? What are they missing?
So I would say, yes, living standards have improved. When I first started working in this field, economists sort of used one measurement, and that was economic, right? They were looking at per capita income as a measure of improvement for human beings. And of course, that gave way to the Human Development Index, which is a much more nuanced read of improvement over a range of indicators, right, and measurements that include everything from literacy to health access. Are there water and sanitation facilities, things like that, right? Because we're not just talking about how much money you can make. We're talking about what kind of life can you live with that money that you're making. I think economists, they can point to overall improvements, but we still have pockets of stubborn inequality, right? And we still, despite bringing everybody into the market economy, we still see people falling behind. And those people are historically the most marginalized in the countries. In other words, there's something else at play here. And it does have to do with a range of marginalizations, geographical marginalization, racial discrimination, gender discrimination. There's still a range of things in society that are keeping individuals and collectives from living their best lives. I also would quibble around greater political stability today in the region. Bolivia just had an attempted coup. We have a very fragile democracy in Peru right now, very weakened government. We have some very interesting leaders right now in Latin America. We have governments really struggling in places like Ecuador, Honduras, right? We have a new government in Mexico. That looks interesting. But Paraguay is another one that's struggling. So I feel that not all is well and happy on that front. And I think the political instability is directly related to economic challenges, including challenges around what I think we'll get into a little bit more, and that is the environment and the larger environmental crisis that countries are facing. So they're facing an economic crisis, but they also have a big environmental crisis that has to be addressed. And that is, in my mind, really contributing to a lot of the instability that we're seeing in the region.
And I'm really hoping to talk about the environmental impact more. I just want to focus on the inequality aspect a little bit more. In our mega development course, we read this great excerpt from Saskin and his idea of expulsions. Can you talk to me a little bit more about the systemic nature of the people who are left out or marginalized of mainstream society or the economy?
Right. Well, Saskia Sassen just wrote this really great book to show us, to get us thinking about looking at the edges, what happens out on the edges of society. Sometimes, we don't start paying attention to things until they're on top of us. But early on, there's been huge movement of rural populations, especially in the Andes where I was living and working. That was going on in the 80s and 90s. It was in full swing. And that was a message that people could no longer make a living in the places they were. They had to deploy either members of their family or themselves to other places to be able to cobble together a livelihood. Farms no longer produced enough food or income for families to live from farming, right? And here we saw, the sort of explosion of what they called micro enterprise, but it wasn't just about an enterprise. It was micro trading. It was in some cases illegal trading, right? There was a lot of gray area kind of stuff happening where people were just trying to figure out how to put a living together. This coincided, of course, with neoliberal economic policies, the restriction and the retraction of the state, fewer social programs that got replaced by sort of World Bank support programs. Large numbers of people just emptied out of the Andes, and they would be in Argentina in the fields, they would be in the factories in Sao Paulo, they would be trading between Chile and Bolivia. It wasn't that these things didn't happen before, but all of a sudden it just exploded, right? Same in Peru. All of a sudden, the streets of Lima were filled with traders. And when I'm talking traders, sometimes people were just selling a bag of oranges. They'd set up a blanket on the street and sell a bag of oranges one by one, or cigarettes out of a pack. I mean, it was pretty horrendous when you think that's how people were trying to make enough money to eat and to feed their kids, right? And of course, you saw kids out there too. Everybody in the family was deployed. And that sort of was the signal that this economic restructuring that was under structural adjustment programs was just an earthquake, right? And the folks who called for these programs, I think, woke up and realized, oh, this is this is this is having much more implications than we could have ever anticipated, right? And then you see all the structural funds. I can't remember what they called them. There were certain, sort of emergency funds that were trying to provide minimal amounts of money to families that were suffering the worst of the cash transfer programs and the rest of it that sort of tried to respond to the economic emergency, the food emergency that countries were living. So again, I think when we don't take inequality seriously, some of our strategies and our responses worsen their situation because we don't understand the depth of inequality in some of these societies and what that means.
So it sounds like these inequalities and vulnerabilities are not a bug of the system, but a feature, and it seems like they are being reproduced instead of being remedied. I'm wondering, what are some of the environmental implications of this growth? How has this to the earth, and what are some of the consequences of the growth that we've seen throughout the past few decades?
Development is a project that wanted to both address poverty through and promote economic growth. And the economic growth was also linked to creating more markets for developed countries to be able to sell things, right? So there was a whole set of institutions created and deployed in order to promote international development. And the focus of most of this was really on producing physical capital, right? So this idea is infrastructure. Think all forms of infrastructure, right? We're going to build because that's what countries need investment, and they did. They did need investment in roads. And they still do, and they needed investment in sanitation, communication systems, and the like. No disagreement there. There was also focus on fostering human capital, education and health in particular, but that was always secondary, right? And there was much less money, and that was sort of seen as soft development. But part of the problem in this focus, in my mind, this approach, was that development economics always bypassed or sort of dismissed nature. And I remember very vividly living in Chile, and the smog in Chile during the winter would just be ferocious. It was incredible. And I got into a discussion, having come out of, the University of California, just graduated and very environmental minded, and saying, why isn't Chile doing more to address environmental contamination? And I got a very pat answer from a Chilean economist saying, we have to grow first, then we'll deal with the environment. And I think in a nutshell, that kind of sums up how development economists have approached the environment in Latin America. It's something to borrow from. It's something to dump on, but it never really figured into the calculations of economic growth and what it really costs. So I would say, yes, there's been prosperity and improvement economically, but it's produced an accelerated degradation over the last 60 years that is probably the region's most important challenge. An economy, a robust economy cannot be only built on, for example, natural resource extraction. It has to be built on a sound stewardship of its assets, all its assets, including natural assets. And that has not happened. It's really grow first, we'll figure out the environment part later.
To play devil's advocate a little bit here again, and I don't like to employ these arguments, but some people who disagree with you might say, well, if you prioritize the environment over economic growth, then you will start to see standards of living decrease and you will start to see more people being marginalized or left out of the economy because of that. And even in economics, there really is no good answer to environmental degradation. I mean, the main goal of economists is to constantly be growing. And unfortunately, there's only so much energy, so much matter in the world. You can't expand GDP forever. How do you see the balance between the environment and growth? Can there be sustainable development, for lack of a better term? And is there a way where we can not marginalize people or worsen living standards while also being able to protect the environment?
I disagree with economists who make that argument. Living standards are being degraded right now because of environmental degradation. And we can pretend that economic growth is going to outpace environmental degradation. But right now, there are a lot of people who can no longer farm. They have lost their homes along the coast. They have lost their coastal-based livelihoods because the mangrove swamps are gone, or because fish populations have been overfished, or because contamination has destroyed the habitat from which they were fishing. And there are so many people around the world who have found themselves in a state of precarity because of rising sea levels, because it's too hot to do the kinds of work they used to do, because they can no longer count on enough good years in a 10-year period to make agriculture production economically viable. So I disagree with their calculation that thinking about the environment is going to take away from growth. A robust economy means we have to pay attention to that environmental degradation. It's yelling at us. There is no future economic growth if we continue to have large-scale disasters. And it kind of looks like we've hit the 1.5 centigrade mark. So now we're in uncharted territory, right? I think of those Caribbean islands that just got leveled in this last hurricane, right? These are the kind of storms that we've never seen. We've never seen a Category 5 storm in July. These are what we're playing with. So I don't think we can say, well, we need to grow now and we'll kind of figure it out.
Right.
It's on us. And what we need to figure out is, how do we grow and at the same time preserve our natural capital and restore natural capital in order to preserve economy and livelihoods. And we're in a different equation now, and I'm not sure economics has caught up with this. And I really want to stress for a minute biodiversity, because this is a big one. We need biodiversity. It plays a huge role in sustaining the planet and sustaining human life, but all life. And we don't have an economics of biodiversity. We really don't know how to value biodiversity, right? And this is a problem. We don't value it. It's not counted. It's not considered important.
Right. No, you remind me, I was first introduced to the concept of development in a development economics course. And I remember at the very beginning of the course, our professor gave us this very simplistic exercise. He said, pretend you're an island nation and you're starting a fishing company. And so you need to buy a certain amount of boats to gain the certain amount of profitability. and you just keep, after a certain point, you just try and keep buying as many boats as possible to maximize your profits. And at the end of the exercise, my professor said, not once did it dawn on you that you can overfish the seas. And so maybe adding more and more boats every year isn't the key because eventually you'll run out of fish and then there's no more profits at all. Of course, it's a vast oversimplification, but it gets the point across.
We have to be good stewards. We need an economics of stewardship,
Yes.
right? And and even an economics of kind of recovery at this point, because we've drawn down the natural assets so much that we need to think about, okay, now how do we recover? How do we hold the line so there's no further degradation? And then how do we slowly rebuild and recover? And that's not easy for everybody to do. Certain countries and economies are going to be in a better position to do that than others.
So I think, again, to play the economist, they would say, well, we introduced this notion of sustainable development into the development discourse. What do you make of the notion of sustainable development? Is it truly sustainable in the environmental sense? And what are some of the contradictions that that has presented?
The concept of it, I have no beef with. There is a sense that we should not be drawing down more that will endanger what future generations can use. We don't want future generations to start out with a huge debt. I mean, none of us would want that. We certainly don't want to leave that going forward. But this is a hard concept for folks to wrap their head around, and it's been important for people to think about, how do we do things sustainably? What does that mean if we're in forestry, if we're working in the forestry sector? What does that mean for agriculture? What does that mean for provisioning urban services, right? Water use and the like. So it has pushed us to think, but unfortunately, I think the incentives haven't been strong enough to push us to think faster. In other words, there's still incentives that go against sustainability, particularly around fossil fuels in the transport sector, right? And home heating and the rest of it. I mean, at least in the US, the incentives to really think and design sustainable transport systems and the like, it's taken too long. And we're catching up.
No,
So while I agree, sustainable development's an important concept, I don't think it's just taken too long. And then on the other hand, sadly, it gets distorted. It gets misused. And we don't really have measures and sort of ways to verify if indeed some claims of sustainability hold. Right?
So it seems like we haven't abandoned some of the worst tendencies of economic growth within development, which I think is a good segue to talking about mega development. So development used to be a little bit more local or even national in its practice, but now we're starting to see not just national or even regional development models or policies, but global. We see this through things like Belt and Road. Joe Biden talked about Build Back Better World. And so it seems like development, for a few different reasons, is really starting to ramp up in scale. What are some of the implications of that, or what are some of your concerns around mega development, especially from an environmental perspective?
Right. Well, we're still in the period or the time of global trade, right? Where we can extract and ship things across the globe in record time. And all of these sort of initiatives are aimed at being able to compress time distance so that we can get things to the consumer all the faster. And in that way, grow markets, create economic opportunity, and promote economic growth. And of course, the environment doesn't come into this discussion whatsoever. I think, there's a lot of reasons why governments, international donor agencies, private equity funds now see large-scale development projects favorably. They like these because there's something for everybody. They all have their own incentives for promoting, funding, investing in these schemes. And you'll remember from mega development, we talked about Bent Flyberg's 4 sublimes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember them.
Political, technological, aesthetic, and what was the last one? Political.
What are you? What did you study?
Oh, geez, what political? Economic? Was that the last one?
Exactly, that's it. The 4th is economic, right? And I think that, to provide a simple answer, I think those 4 sublimes are real drivers of why mega development, these global schemes are so attractive. There's a lot they can pack in, and they can please a broad audience, and they can create strong constituencies. So we are in the midst of a global boom in large scale development, because but what's odd is it's almost as if the discussions around the global environmental crisis, the climate crisis, is not on their screens at all. Right? They're like 2 completely distinct conversations. If you want to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative specifically, this is a global game changer. It is changing the flows of commodities around the world. It's reshaping trade relations, and in the process, reshaping landscapes. It's bold, and it's also disconcerting at once, right? And there's a lot of reasons. I mean, 2 of them that pop on my screen immediately are, the lack of transparency and accountability. The Chinese do things very differently. They have their own way of engaging with governments, that doesn't necessarily follow the concession-based sort of, or the way that international donor agencies place constraints and restrictions linked to financing of projects. You don't get that with Chinese investment and development assistance.
Right. So I see that in the West, there's a little bit of an ideological shift away from neoliberal policies. And for a long time, the West were the only development players in town. Now we see the rise of other players like China or in the Middle East. They have much different political systems. And so with these new actors, with these shifts in ideologies, do you have any hope that some of these mega development projects can reduce these inequalities or better the lives of marginalized groups, or do you see this as another opportunity for these inequalities to be reproduced?
Well, they certainly could have the opportunity. Every project is an opportunity to reorganize, if you will, who's involved in the decision making around the project. However, I think, not wanting to be too skeptical, there seems, because there's a certain lack of transparency and accountability, it's going to be very hard for affected populations. For example, if you're going to build a road, those who live along or whose territories are going to be impacted by that road, it's going to be very difficult for them, A, to access information about the project, and B, to sit at the table and be able to voice their concerns and negotiate some sort of agreement around protocols, around where the project will pass through, economic compensation for environmental harm, and the rest of it, right? Those all take time, and they take a certain commitment to make sure that projects are done right. My experience watching these sorts of infrastructure investments is that folks are in a hurry. They want it to be done, and they don't necessarily have a lot of experience negotiating with historically marginalized groups. And so we get to a situation where, they use shortcuts, and the shortcuts aren't participatory, and the shortcuts don't improve transparency and accountability. It's a challenge. The Chinese, are very committed to these large scale trade routes. They want to secure a steady and reliable flow of commodities that's important to their economy. And they'll do that by creating relationships and they refer to this as friendship with nations that produce what they're interested in buying. But there's no commitment to human rights issues. There's no commitment to inclusivity or sustainability. They do talk about green infrastructure, but I don't know that much about, what that means on the ground for projects. I see BRI as a sort of, it follows a long history in development work of focusing on infrastructure and building, and the Chinese are just taking that writ large and creating, more connected systems of infrastructure. And I worry. I worry that this is, in the long haul, there's no real discussion about, well, what does this mean when things are being extracted from environmentally protected areas or biodiverse areas. There's such a rush to do these projects. I fear that the environmental regulations that are in place will be relaxed or otherwise loosened so that these projects can go forward. That's the most likely scenario. And if that happens, then the rights of those people who are going to be impacted by the projects are also going to diminish.
It seems like we're at a very pivotal time in world history, and there seems to be a lot of paradigm shifts going on within economics, development, politics, and I hope that it is in a better direction, in a more just direction. So I know you have to go soon. My final question for you that I ask all the guests on our podcast is, what is one thing about the world, big or small, that you would change?
Wow. If we took nature seriously and understood that it's not something we can manage later, we have to figure it out now, that would be a huge shift. And I would feel heartened that we can do something in time, because at the end, environmental degradation is going to hurt the poor the worst first, and that we should not let that happen. We can do better than we're doing. So I would say that, that we learn that it's not economic growth now and nature later. It's environment right next to economic growth. It's a puzzle. It's a challenge. But I do think we have the capacity to address a challenge. So that would be my pearl of wisdom.
Well, I hope it's a puzzle that we can solve. Dr. Denise Bebbington, thank you again for coming onto the podcast today.
Thank you, Nathan. It was fun.
And that's it for this week's episode of the Henry George School podcast. Thank you for listening, and we hope it made you think. If you'd like to learn more about our research and policy tools, check out hgsss.org. That's hgsss.org. If you'd like to listen to our content as soon as it's published, subscribe to our show. If you like the show, please leave us a rating, review, or even share it with a friend. It goes a long way. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.